Chapter 33. This is where we turn to head back, Will told Tug. A tall pole had been hammered into the ground to mark the spot. The little horse studied the marker with interest. Will turned and looked back towards the oasis. It was now out of sight, hidden by the undulating ground, but he knew it was 4 kilometres distant. 4 kilometres out, 4 back, 8 in all. He had tried for 12, then 10. Finally, he had to settle for an 8-kilometre race course. He hoped it would be far enough for Tug's stamina and staying power to assert itself over Sandstorm. It would be a close thing, he knew. The Erak horse was definitely faster over a short distance. For the first kilometre or two, he would leave Tug behind. But then the Ranger horse would start to reel him in as the Erak stallion began to slow and Tug maintained his speed. "We'll win it on the back leg," Will told Tug. He had decided to walk the horse over the course to familiarise him with it, and to give them both a chance to spot any hidden holes or unevenness that might bring them down. Tug shook his head and whinnied softly. At times like this, Will was never totally sure that the horse was just responding to the sound of his master's voice. It often seemed that he understood every word Will said to him and was agreeing or disagreeing. Or we'll lose it on the back leg, Will thought. But he didn't speak the thought aloud in case it put negative concepts in Tug's mind. He hoped that the second 4 kilometres would give Tug the chance to make up the distance he'd lose on the first half of the race. Then, when they drew level with the Erak horse and rider, another contest would begin. Horses like Tug and Sandstorm hated to lose, hated to have another horse ahead of them. As Tug drew alongside Sandstorm, Will knew, the Erak horse would dig deep for a greater effort, to put the little foreigner back in his place. Tug, meanwhile, would be straining for extra speed to pass the Erak horse. It was then a matter of judgment for the two riders, to pick the point where they should let the horses have their heads. Too soon, and the energy and speed would peter out before the finish line. Too late, and there wouldn't be time to overtake. Each rider would do his best to force his opponent into going too early. The moment had to be just right, or the result would be failure. Will frowned thoughtfully. He'd watched as Hassan put Sandstorm through his paces, but he was sure the Erak rider was holding something back. As they walked back towards the oasis, Tug's head butted him in the shoulder, sending him staggering. "Stop worrying," the horse seemed to say. "I know what I'm doing, even if you don't." "Just don't go too soon, that's all," Will cautioned him. Again, Tug tossed his head disdainfully. They walked slowly back into the oasis. Unlike Hassan, Will had no need to familiarise himself with his mount's little peculiarities. He and Tug knew each other's ways back to front and inside out. A curious crowd of Bedouin watched them as they entered the camp. It was early morning, and the race was set for late that same afternoon, when the full heat of the day had passed. He knew that there had been a lot of betting on the race. It was impossible not to hear conversations in the camp, even though he tried to appear aloof to such matters. He also knew that most of the betting wasn't about the actual outcome of the race. It was about the margin by which Sandstorm would win. The Bedouin were familiar with the beautifully formed Erak stallion that Hassan would be riding. It seemed that none of them gave the shaggy little barrel-shaped horse from the north any chance of winning. Even though Will had the utmost faith in Tug, faced with such universal disbelief, he found it hard to keep his spirits up. Yet he had to believe they could win, that they would win. The prospect of losing was just too awful to contemplate. He had been too impulsive, he thought, to risk losing Tug in such a way. Yet, time and again, throughout the day, when he racked his brains to think of what else he could have done, He came up with no answer. If he were to get Tug back, he would have to risk losing him. The thought tortured him through the long, heavy hours of the middle of the day. Then, as the sun began to slant down and the shadows of the palms stretched out further and further, it was time. His face was grim and set as he led Tug through the oasis to the start line. Hassan was waiting, mounted on the beautiful Palomino, by the line that had been gouged in the sand. Like Will, who had discarded his cloak for the race, he wore shirt, trousers and boots, and a keffiyeh. The headgear would protect the riders' faces from flying sand and dust during the race. He nodded a greeting as Will and Tug moved towards the starting line. Will nodded back. He didn't speak. He couldn't bring himself to wish Hassan good luck. He didn't want Hassan to have anything but bad luck. If Hassan managed to fall off Sandstorm in the first 50 meters and break a leg, Will wouldn't mind in the slightest. Yet, looking at the Bedouin youth's easy seat on the horse, as Sandstorm moved nervously, prancing slightly, ears pricked with eagerness for the coming contest, it didn't seem likely. Hassan seemed glued to the saddle, an integral part of the horse. Will put his foot in the stirrup and swung up astride Tug. "That's it, boy," he whispered. The horse tossed his head. Will drew one end of the keffiyeh across his face and twisted the other end over it to hold it in place. Now only his eyes showed through a narrow slit. The rest of his face was covered. Beside him, Hassan did the same. Sandstorm pawed the ground eagerly, kicking up small clouds of dust. Beside him, Tug stood stolidly, all 4 feet planted firmly. The difference between the two horses was all too obvious. One prancing, eager, and light-footed, his coat groomed till he gleamed. The other solid, barrel-chested, and shaggy. More money changed hands as last-minute bets were made. "Riders, are you ready?" Umar stepped forward as he called them. Hassan waved one arm. "Ready, Asik," he called. The Bedouin cheered, and he waved to the watching crowd. "Ready," Will said. His voice was muffled behind the keffiyeh, and he had to force the word out through a throat constricted by anxiety. There was no cheer this time. As far as he knew, nobody had bet on him, only the distance by which he'd lose. And that was hardly something they were going to cheer about. "Move to the line, but remember, if you cross it before the start signal, you will have to turn and go back to cross it again." Hassan edged Sandstorm forward, crabbing him sideways. This was a tricky moment for him. With the horse prancing and excited, he had to hold back a meter or two from the line to make sure he didn't cross prematurely. Will nudged Tug, and the little horse moved quietly to the line. "Hold there, boy," Will said quietly. Tug's ears twitched in response, and he stopped, his 4 hooves only centimeters from the line. One of the Bedouin, who had been assigned the task of monitoring the start line, crouched and peered closely at the horse's hooves, then straightened as he realized Tug wasn't infringing. But he kept his eyes riveted on the line and Tug's feet. Seeing it, Will touched Tug with one toe. "Back up, boy," he said. He wasn't willing to take the risk that the judge might be over-eager to penalize him. Tug obediently retreated 1 pace. A few of the Bedouin frowned thoughtfully. The horse was well trained. Was there more they should know about? "There will be no interference between the riders. If either of you interferes with the other, he will automatically lose." The 2 riders, now intent on the course that stretched out before them through the desert, nodded their acknowledgement. There were marshals stationed along the course to make sure neither of them cheated. "Ride straight to the marker, round it, and ride back again. The start line is also the finish line," Umar said. Neither rider nodded this time. They knew the course. Both had been over it during the day. "The starting signal will be a blast on Tarik's horn. The minute you hear it, you may start." Tarik, an elder of the tribe, stepped forward with a large brass horn. He brandished it so they could both see it. Earlier in the day, Will had been made familiar with the note of the horn. "In your hands, Tarik, and in God's will," Umar intoned. It was the official notice that the next sound to be heard would be the starter's horn. An expectant silence fell over the crowd. Somewhere, a child started to ask a question. Umar looked round angrily, and the mother quickly silenced her offspring. Umar gestured to Tarik, and the older man raised the large, bell-mouthed horn to his lips. Will watched him intensely. He saw the Beduin's chest swell as he took a deep breath. Beside him and slightly behind him, he knew, Hassan would be watching like a hawk. He tightened his grip on the reins, forced himself to relax his legs around Tug's body. He didn't want to send any inadvertent signal to the horse before it was time. Now! The horn brayed its metallic baritone note, and he squeezed Tug with his knees. Dimly, he heard Hassan's yelled, "Yah!" as he urged Sandstorm forward. The crowd roared with one huge voice. Then the sound cut off in shock. Tug shot away from his stiff-legged stance like an arrow, going from stock still to full gallop in the space of a few meters. Sandstorm, excited and prancing, was left behind, curvetting and tossing his head for the first few paces. Then Hassan clapped his heels into the Palomino's sides, and he stretched out in a gallop after Tug. The crowd, silenced momentarily by Tug's incredible acceleration from a standing start, began yelling again, screaming for Hassan and Sandstorm to run him down. Even Will, who was aware of Tug's phenomenal ability to accelerate, was a little surprised at the lead they had established already. He knew that Sandstorm would overhaul them before long. Once he was in stride, the Iridi was definitely faster than Tug over a kilometre or two. But now he hoped the shock of being left behind at the start would force Hassan to overstretch his mount, using up some of the precious energy reserves that would become so important in the last few kilometres. Behind him, vaguely, he could hear the yelling tribesmen. Closer too, he heard the rolling thunder of Sandstorm's hooves on the rocky ground. Tug's ears were up and his legs were churning, throwing a plume of sand and dust into the air behind them. Will touched his neck. "Take it easy, boy. Pace yourself." Tug's head tossed fractionally in response. Not too much, as he didn't want to lose stride or balance as he did so. Will felt him ease a little and nodded. Sandstorm's hooves were closer behind him now. The Iridi horse was fast as lightning, he thought. Hassan, a few meters behind them, was worried. He had no idea how fast the foreign horse would be. The horse's lines and configuration gave no hint of his startling off-the-mark speed. And even now that Sandstorm was gaining, he was doing so much more slowly than Hassan would have liked. He urged the horse to give a little more and heaved a sigh of relief as he began to draw alongside the foreigner and the shaggy little grey. The other rider didn't turn his head to look at them, but Hassan saw the horse's eye rolling to view them as they came alongside. Fast horses hate being led in a race, and this was definitely a fast horse. Not as fast as Sandstorm, but faster than he had expected. In Hassan's experience, once a horse found itself overtaken and led by another, it would often give in, or overextend itself, trying desperately to regain the lead. Hassan knew it was time to establish his horse's superiority. He flicked the reins against Sandstorm's neck, and the Palomino found another few meters of speed. He surged forward, away from Tug. Will felt Tug begin to respond, and for the first time he could remember, he checked him firmly with the rein. Tug snorted angrily. He wanted to show this flashy Eriddy horse what racing was all about. But he obeyed Will's touch and denied his own instinctive urge to go all out. "Not yet, boy," he heard Will's voice. "Long way to go." They flashed past the 2-kilometre mark, hearing the cheers of the marshals stationed there as they went. The cheers were all for Sandstorm, who was now leading Tug by nearly 40 metres. The Eriddy horse ran beautifully, Will thought grimly, with a long, powerful stride and perfect rhythm. 40 metres was far enough, he thought. He signalled Tug to increase his pace a little, and Tug responded. Will felt a surge of affection for the horse under him. Tug would keep running like this all day, he knew. He wondered if Sandstorm could do the same. He estimated that they had picked up 5 to 10 metres when Hassan and Sandstorm rounded the halfway marker. Comfortably in the lead, Hassan had eased his horse's pace a little, knowing that his best turn of speed was behind them now. He waved as they passed the other rider and horse. There was no response from Will, and Hassan grinned behind his keffiyeh. He wouldn't wave if he were losing either, he thought. Round the halfway marker, Tug's hooves clattered on the stony ground, skidding slightly as they turned and set out after Sandstorm. They'd picked up a little distance when Sandstorm turned, lost it again when they followed suit. Maybe less than 30 metres between them now. "Go now, Tug," Will yelled, and the horse dug deep into his reserves of strength and endurance and courage and accelerated under him. Will could see Sandstorm through the cloud of dust and sand he was kicking up. Appropriate name, he thought grimly. The Palomino's flanks were streaked with sweat and his sides heaving with exertion. Slowly, Tug narrowed the gap to the Eriddy horse. With 2 kilometres to go, he moved alongside, the 2 horses plunging side by side, each head alternately taking the lead, losing it, taking it again, as they raced stride for stride, neither gaining on the other. There would be a moment, Will knew, when it was time for the final sprint. Both horses and both riders were aware of it. It was a matter of perfect timing. Too soon, and the horse would be exhausted before the finish line. Too late, and the race would be lost. The horses, side by side, glared at each other, their eyes rolling in their heads, whites showing so each could view the enemy. Then Tug surged ahead, and Will couldn't check him. To do so now would be to lose speed, and Tug had cast the dice for them, sensing the moment. He moved a neck length, then a body length ahead of Sandstorm, moving faster than Will could ever remember him doing. The drumming of the horse's hooves filled his consciousness. Then he heard Hassan yelling encouragement to Sandstorm, and, turning his head slightly, he saw the Eriddy horse begin to regain ground on them. Unbelievably, he was overhauling Tug yet again. Then Tug faltered. It was the slightest break in rhythm and pace, but Will felt it and knew it was all over. Sandstorm saw it too, and lunged ahead of them. 1 metre, 2, 5. The clouds of dirt and sand flew up in Will's face, stinging the small area of skin exposed around his eyes, forcing him to grit his eyes almost shut. There were 300 metres to go, and Sandstorm was 15 metres ahead of them. Tears blurred Will's vision as he realised he had lost the race, and his horse. He knew he could ask Tug for more. He could urge him to try to catch up, and he knew the little horse would respond until the effort killed him. Tug had already hit the wall. Sandstorm's pace had been too much. The early lead it had given him had been too great. He was 20 metres ahead of them. And then he faltered. Will saw the slight stagger in his step, the loss of rhythm, the slackening in the blinding speed. If only they'd waited, he thought bitterly. Tug had been too eager. but now the 20-meter lead would be enough to carry the exhausted Sandstorm across the finish line ahead of his equally exhausted opponent. He had barely had the thought when he felt Tug accelerate beneath him. All the power, all the certainty, all the balance was back in his stride as he went to another level of performance, a level Will had never seen before. Tug stretched out and reeled in Sandstorm as if the taller horse were standing still. An amazed Will crouched low over Tug's neck, little more than a passenger. He realized that he had never had any idea how fast Tug could run. It seemed there was no upper limit. Tug would simply run as fast as the situation demanded. He realized that Tug had controlled the race, pretending to falter when he did to goad Sandstorm into a final spurt. The loss of stride and balance had been a feint, and Sandstorm had swallowed the bait, accelerating away and exhausting his last reserves just 30 meters too soon. That was the gap between them when Tug rocketed over the finish line. Will had already dismounted and was hugging the little horse's neck when Sandstorm, now slowed to a canter, sweat-streaked and blowing, staggered wearily over the line behind him. And now the Bedouin did cheer for the foreign horse, because they loved good horses and they realized they had just seen one of the best. And besides, since none of the bets were predicated on Tug's winning, nobody had lost any money to anyone else, although those who had bet on a 30-meter margin were tempted to claim their winnings. Umar took Sandstorm's rein when Hassan slid down from the saddle. Before the young man could speak, the Asik slapped him on the shoulder. "You did your best," he said. "Good race." Others were echoing the sentiment when Hassan pushed his way through the crowd to offer his hand to Will. He shook his head admiringly. "I was never going to win, was I?" he asked. "You knew that." Will, grinning widely, shook his hand. "Actually, I didn't know it," he said. He jerked his head at Tug. "He did."